Welcome to the countdown to episode 2 of And She Could Be Next. I'm Danielle Belton, editor-in-chief of The Root, and before we begin, here are some things everyone watching can do right now to step into their power. First, watch And She Could Be Next and tell your friends about it. It'll be on your local PBS station or streaming online at andshecouldbenext.com in an hour at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Make your vote plan. One of the best ways to create change is to vote. Go to andshecouldbenext.com to learn more. Lift up the women of color who you think should run for something or be the boss of something, or the unsung heroes in your life who are already leading in their own way. Use the hashtag #SheCouldBeNextPBS to tag someone you think should be next. I also want to give a shout out to some of the organizations that are watching along with us tonight: the NAACP and Community Change. Thank you for joining us. Okay, let's start tonight's program. Last night in episode 1, we saw a historic group of women of color, both candidates and organizers, build a movement to create change in their communities. We saw the unique challenges they face, from well-resourced incumbents to systemic barriers that disproportionately affect Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. But we also saw the joy in their fight and the hope in their leadership. Tonight, as we prepare to watch part 2, we're going to lean into a slightly different conversation. All movements face challenges, and one of the greatest threats to our democracy, and especially communities of color, is voter suppression. That issue is at the heart of episode 2 and at the heart of our conversation tonight. But don't worry, it's not all bad news. It's true what they say that not all superheroes wear capes. And tonight we're talking to women from all walks of life who are leading the way with the strategies we need to save our democracy. Tonight, I'm joined by the filmmaking team behind And She Could Be Next: Grace Lee, Marjan Safinia, and Jyoti Sardin. Welcome, ladies.
Hi, Danielle. Thank you for hosting us.
Hello.
Glad to be here and glad to have you. My first question is for Grace and Marjan. Can you tell us a little bit about what viewers can expect in episode 2?
Sure. Well, tonight we're going to watch our candidates and organizers move into the general election. We hone in on Georgia, where we see a multiracial coalition of organizers, Black, Latinx, Asian Americans, and others work to get communities to the polls in the face of voter suppression. Following the chaos on election day in Georgia, we see them fight to make sure that every vote is counted. We'll also see what happens post-2018 as some of our history-making candidates are elected and the challenges they face as women of color in governance. We see how, some of these communities that they represent are being actively targeted by the current administration.
One of the things we wanted to make sure that our viewers tonight know is that we're really disappointed that Detroit Public Television and Georgia Public Broadcasting, which is a statewide public television network, have both declined to carry this show on the air, which makes it extra hard for people to see their own story. This is of particular concern to us in Georgia, given how much of tonight's episode focuses on voter suppression. And we actually consider this an act of viewer suppression. So we're asking folks who are watching us tonight on Facebook, if you're in Georgia, if you're in Detroit, if you have friends and family in those places, please let them know about their story being on screen. And I'm just going to do a quick rundown of other ways that you can watch it. So if you have a smart TV, you can look up the PBS app, look for POV, and you'll find And She Could Be Next, both episodes there. And if you are on your web browser, if you go to andshecouldbenext.com/watch, you'll be able to watch both episodes there. And they're going to stay up for about 60 days, which means you can take your time to catch up. But it's incredibly important that the people who we made the story about get to see their own stories. So we hope you'll help us spread the word.
Amazing. So let's pivot from there to watching a clip from the series to illustrate a bit of what both of you just spoke about.
Lauren, our campaign manager, asked our data director to create a map of where people were asked to vote provisionally. And in every community of color, it was, every other house. Yeah, it was just brutal. It was exactly what we tried to prevent, a targeted effort to prevent people from having their voices heard on that day.
Are you checking the white districts too to see if they're down?
Just voted here. It was very fast and I was in and out within minutes.
There was no line. It went smoothly. Everything was posted clearly.
I've heard a lot about voter suppression. I've never seen any problems at any of these polling stations. So
by the time I reached the hotel for our election night party, I was not confident, in part because I knew that the nefarious behavior of my opponent and those who supported him were coming to bear.
Thousands of voters were forced to vote a provisional ballot today due to machine breakdowns and shoddy election administration overseen by the current Secretary of State, Brian Kemp.
Weeks before Election Day, Lauren had put together a set of election night scenarios, knowing how close it was.
We planned for victory, we planned for a contested election, we planned for a hung decision that we didn't quite know what happened.
And what's so crazy is that we had this scenario Z, and it was at the very end of this long list of scenarios.
A scenario that was like large-scale machine breakdowns, large-scale chaos on Election Day.
Scenario Z was designed to say, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to have to react. And indeed, by 1 a.m. on November 7th, we were at Scenario Z.
All right, let's dive right in. I'm excited to welcome our first panel, award-winning filmmaker, executive producer of And She Could Be Next, Ava DuVernay, the representative for Georgia's 6th Congressional District, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, Georgia State Senator and Chairwoman of the Democratic Party of Georgia, Nikema Williams, President, CEO, and co-founder of the Higher Heights Leadership Fund, Glynda Carr, and co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, LaTosha Brown. This first question, any of you guys could answer. In 2018, we witnessed a historic wave of women and women of color candidates running for office and winning. Why is that important?
Well, I'll jump in. So 2018 was the 50th anniversary of Shirley Chisholm being elected the first Black woman to ever serve in Congress. And so 50 years later, we saw a record number of Black women run for office. And we celebrate those gains, but at the end of the day, the 23 million Black women in this country are still underrepresented and underserved. What was inspiring about 2018 were the women like Lucy McBath, like Stacey Abrams, and the 4 other Black women who ultimately were elected to Congress in 2018. They were leading in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed, and they were still jumping over hurdles and knocking down doors. And so there's a roadmap for moving forward. And what you see in 2020 is another record number of Black women running for office.
And I think, too, after the devastating loss that we saw in 2016 with Secretary Clinton, I think we recognize that if we were going to be able to create and stimulate change, we were going to have to do it ourselves. Because historically, women of color, we have been underestimated, we have been overlooked, and it's important for us to make sure that we have diversity in the people that represent us, our state and local elections, federal elections. And I think we really had an awakening. As we say, we're woke. And after 2016, we recognized that we were going to have to stand up. We were going to have a seat at the table, because no one can really make sure that we are provided for, that we are cared for, that our communities are protected, but us. People will come along to help affect change for us, but we have to be responsible and accountable for our own futures.
I also think that another piece, another value, particularly having women of color who run, when you look at the campaigns, when you look at Congresswoman McBath's campaign, when you look at Stacey Abrams, there was a broad-based coalition. We're able to really build a inclusive, multiracial, multi-generational coalition. So I think that there's another value in having women of color, that we're able to build these multiracial campaigns that are more reflective of a reflective democracy that in fact that we need in this country.
Now, it's clear that American democracy is at a crossroads. We're experiencing a convergence of challenges from racial violence and the righteous response of protesting in the streets to fix these racial inequalities, from systematic voter suppression across the country, and of course, what's happening against the backdrop of a global pandemic. We need effective leadership more than ever. What are some of the tactics we should consider to recapture that lightning in a bottle moment from 2018 now in 2020?
So a couple of quick thoughts. One, I think we have to disabuse ourselves from the idea that America has ever had a true democracy. A democracy has never been fully realized in this country. And so we have to start there. From the time that Black people have been forced enslaved on the shores, we have fought, right, for our humanity to be recognized. And so even from post-Reconstruction on down, we have fought for the right to vote. And so I think ultimately when we're talking about what has to be done, one, we've got to make sure that we're fighting for there to be a true democracy in this country, that we can't hide behind this idea that America is the premier democracy for the world when it's not so, when we're seeing millions of people be disenfranchised in the process. And so I think that that's one thing. I think we have to have a real check around where is the state of democracy in this country. I think the second thing is that we have to radically reimagine every system in this country. That fundamentally what has undergirded every system in this country has been structural racism, right? We can go from the right to vote, we can go from the criminal justice system. And so it is a moment for us to radically reimagine, what this country can be. I often say that a lot of times we're making this reference around what did the founders intended? Well, if we were based on what the founders intended, they didn't intend for any of us that are on this call right now to even be in this position. So certainly they didn't have any foresight, right? So ultimately, I think what it is actually for us to really reimagine. We have to think as the new founders of a new America, right? That will be inclusive, that will serve its citizens, and will create real democracy.
And I want to piggyback on that, because I think with the pandemic of COVID-19, I think more than ever around the country now, as communities of color, we've always known systems were broken for us. We've always understood that. But now that we see the systemic racism, lack of education, lack of natural resources, all those isms that we've been suffering by for so many generations, now with COVID-19, I think that's bringing that to the forefront. And I think that is something now that we have recognized, the whole country's recognized, and we've begun to really stand up and really just try to really create effectual change going forward, because we know that all of these isms, all of these systems that have been broken, if we don't stand up, if we don't move forward in trying to collaborate together to really make sure that we have what democracy says we should have under this administration, we will completely be dismantled, and we're going to have to continue to fight for everything that we've had in the past, because it is being dismantled before our very eyes. So yes, that sense of democracy that we believe that we had, that has not always served us as communities of color. So it is our responsibility to make sure that we are tackling all the systemic problems and issues and racism that we live by every single day.
Glynda, do you want to chime in?
Sure. So it is the notion that Black women have always been leading. And so I'm excited to see tonight's episode, particularly because it centers the Black woman's leadership in Georgia. It's the work of Senator Nikema Williams, right? From an activist to, she put on 5 hats in 2018. It is about the everyday people. I mean, the organization did work in Georgia. I thought for myself it was important because my godchildren live in Georgia, and for them to see Black women leading, my oldest godchild wears her hair in an Afro puff. So for her to see every day on news Lucy McBath and Stacey Abrams who wears her hair the same way. It's the possibilities that exist. I went and volunteered for Lucy McBath. It was the energy on that ground that made that special. And be clear, it's the same thing we can do this year across the country. There are amazing Black women running in pockets there's women running in Arkansas, everywhere. And all we need to do is to step into that power and support the work of the women that have stepped off the sidelines boldly to run for office.
I think as chair of the party, the first Black woman to chair the Democratic Party in Georgia, seeing all of this come together from 2018, where people were out and voting in force and never stopped and continued that activism, so that it wasn't just about Stacey Abrams. We all wanted her to win, but making it so much bigger than just one candidate and moving this beyond and coming into our full power and electing so many other candidates up and down the ballot. And then seeing the spotlight of all of the protests happening across the country coinciding with our primary election that the world saw was a disaster on June 9th. But seeing that all come together at one moment where people could actually show up to the polls, cast their votes in a moment while coming off the streets from protesting, and seeing all of this come together has me so very hopeful for what is to come in November.
Amazing. So my next question is for Ava. Storytelling is a powerful tool for inspiring people to step up. Your work on films like The 13th, When They See Us, and Selma have become viral outlets for helping people understand the racial inequalities in an emotional, visceral way. Can you talk a little bit about how you've used stories to inspire, engage, and motivate people?
Well, thank you for having me. I feel like that question is a lovely one, but with these powerful warrior women standing here, I think my mind goes to my duty as a storyteller is to tell their stories, and to tell the stories of our people, and to make sure that those are amplified in the way that they have deserved to be amplified all of this time and have not been, to be told with nuance and with care and with passion, and to make sure that when we're talking about this movement, this time, that we are being focused on who is at the center of those stories. Those cannot always be men. Those cannot always be white folk. That those can't even always be the elected officials. That those have to be the armies of real citizens who are there pushing these women into the place where they are. And so, that's a big thing that we tried to address in Selma. Everyone wanted a Dr. King movie, but Dr. King didn't do any of that alone. And none of these women do it alone. And they know that. And that's a big part of what Grace and Marjan put forth in this doc series, that you really not only saw the women who were running, but the armies of people who were lifting them up and who were putting them in the places where they could lead. And so, as a storyteller, a lot of that comes in my mind as we're crafting the narratives that really shape people's opinion about things. Everything that you see is a story. Every commercial, every article, every news piece, every conversation that you have at the grocery store, or used to have when you could go to the grocery store, those things are, we're all telling each other stories. And I think the goal is to be able to have more kinds and colors of people telling different kinds of stories. And the more we can do that, the more we understand each other, the more that we, believe that other people are like us in the ways that matter. And that you can get to some kind of consensus about humanity, which feels ridiculous that there needs to be a consensus about that, but obviously it is the case.
Thank you. To pivot a little from storytelling, I want to talk to Lucy. You've experienced the devastating impacts of racial violence firsthand. Can you share your story about losing your son, Jordan, with our audience?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity, because as many times as I've told it over and over again, it's important to continue to tell it. As Ava said, we have stories. Communities of color, women of color, we have stories. And our stories have great impact on the ability to be able to move people's mindsets and change their hearts. As I said earlier, I always will be Jordan Davis's mother, no matter what anybody calls me. That is who I am. And I was raising my son just as a suburban mother, and, you know, the northern suburbs of Atlanta, flying for Delta Airlines, have been flying for 30 years as a flight attendant. I originally come from Chicago, come from parents that were very politically aware and astute. I was raised in the civil rights movement. My father was Illinois branch president of the NAACP, so I grew up singing "We Shall Overcome." I grew up in all the marches and rallies, and I was a child in the stroller at the March on Washington. But, you know, I was also dealing with a second bout of breast cancer. And so at that time, I had done all the formal raising with my son, Jordan. I had been a single mom. His father and I decided that we would send him to Jacksonville so that I could get well, and he would go ahead and do the rest of the raising, making him into a man. Jordan and his friends, November 23rd, 2012, the day after Thanksgiving, were simply going shopping from one mall to the next. His father had given him money on Black Friday to go shopping. They stopped for 3.5 minutes at a convenience store gas station. My son Jordan said, you know, guys, if we go to the next mall and we're going to get chewing gum, because if we're going to try to pick up girls, you know, our breath stinks. And that's what a typical young man would say. So they stopped in that 3.5 minutes. A man named Michael Dunn and his girlfriend parked next to them on the passenger side. His girlfriend went in to get a bottle of wine and some chips. In that 3.5 minutes, Michael Dunn had racially profiled the boys, called them gangbangers and thugs, told them to turn down their thug music that he couldn't hear himself think. Started a verbal altercation with the boys, my son in particular, because Jordan was telling him, look, man, just roll up your window. We're not doing anything wrong. We have a right to listen to our music. Well, and in the state of Florida, of course, as many states have stand your ground laws. And, you know, Michael Dunn pulled out his 9mm Glock gun, shot 10 rounds into the car. 3 of those rounds, ballistics say he was deliberately aiming for Jordan. And within those 3.5 minutes, drove away, thought that no one had seen his license plate, thought he'd gotten away with murder. But actually what he did is, after he shot 3 rounds into the car, he got out of his car. The boys were trying to get out of the line of fire, backing away. He tracked them out of the parking lot, then got in his car and drove away. There was a homeless couple that was in the car. They saw everything, wrote down the license plate number on a brown paper bag, gave it into the convenience store clerk. That is the only way we were able to apprehend Michael Dunn, because he'd actually gone back to his hotel, parked his car in the back of the hotel, in the parking lot there. He and his girlfriend, they walked their puppy Charlie. They ordered a pizza. They had a couple of stiff drinks, and they went to bed as if nothing happened. They got up the next morning, saw on television that a young black male had been killed at the convenience store gas station. His girlfriend says, take me home. They get in the car, they drive home back to Satellite Beach, Florida, 170 miles away, parked their car in the garage again, pretended as if nothing happened. But there again, they were apprehended there. It took us 2.5 years in court, in trial, even with witnesses, to get convictions. Michael Dunn is now sitting in prison for life for the first-degree murder of my son, plus additional 30 years for each of the attempted murders on the other boys that were in the car, plus an additional 15 years for shooting a gun in an open public space. And, you know, that was very difficult for us to get that conviction. 7 months before we saw Trayvon Martin gunned down in Florida. And so I began speaking out about my son's tragedy. I was speaking out about Trayvon's tragedy. Why were our legislators refusing to do anything about the numbers of people that continue to die in this country, specifically in communities of color? Why was the clergy silent? I wanted to know why. Why was no one talking about what was happening? Why was no one willing to do anything about the horrific numbers of people of color that are dying in this country? And I became a national advocate for gun safety, became the national spokesperson for Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America and Every Town for Gun Safety, testified all around the country, testified before the United States Senate, just telling my story. As Ava said, just telling my story. And decided after the Parkland tragedy, I'd had enough. Those children were the same age as Jordan when he was gunned down, and still no one was speaking up on behalf of our children. So that's the reason why I decided to run. So tragedy, My tragedy brought me to action, as it does to so many advocates and so many people that are out in the streets, building movements, building organizations to effectively stimulate change.
I also want to ask you, Congresswoman McBath, do you see a difference from when you first ran for office and now in the energy people have for changing policies and systems that harm Black communities specifically?
Absolutely, without a doubt, I do see a difference. However, what I want to say, though, is that I don't think we can afford as a community, as a nation, to be, yes, we're reactive, but you have to have movement and you have to have action behind the reaction. I'm so excited to see people in the streets. I'm so excited to see them marching and rallying and building this movement. But what happens beyond that point? When you go back to your communities and you go back to your families, opening these discussions, having these really hard, difficult discussions with law enforcement, with your community change agents, with, your city council, that's when the work begins. And it's ugly and it's hard and it's difficult and it's not pretty. But that's what effectively creates the changes after we get out of the streets, being in the community, really making a difference. And in Washington, we've done phenomenal work, transformative work with the George Floyd, Justice and Policing Act. That's the first time that this Congressional Black Caucus has given major authority. We've been given major authority to create and stimulate change with law enforcement and, qualified immunity and making sure that we're alleviating chokeholds, everything that systemically hurts our community. So things are changing. They are changing, but we've got to make sure that we're in the trenches, really doing it on the deepest levels to make sure that it's sustainable change. It can't be reactive change. It has to be sustainable for the future and the long haul.
This next question is for the rest of our panel. What is it going to take to get more young people, women, and people of color to run for office and change things from the inside?
I'll start. Just listening to Lucy's story, I remember when she first decided to run for office, and she initially wasn't even running for Congress. Lucy was running for state representative, and there were a lot of people that told her she shouldn't change. She shouldn't run for Congress. She should stay in this role and run for state rep. And I remember the text message that she sent me, and it was the week of qualifying. And I was like, oh, well, Lucy's going to run for Congress. I guess I'm all in at this point because that's what she's decided. But so many times we step up to run for office and we don't have those people that are willing to stand with us and support us. I remember when I decided to run for state senate in 2017, people told me to wait my turn. And, well, Nikema, I don't want you to run for this and your first race be a loss. I'm like, well, if you help me, then I won't lose. And so there's so many hurdles that we have to still face within our own communities and making sure that we're supporting each other when we step up to run for these offices. We all view life through our lived experience, and the best person to make sure that our experiences as Black women are being taken care of in these elective office is to put more Black women in office. So Lucy, I'm glad that you made that decision to step up and run for Congress and didn't listen to all of the people who told you to stay in that state legislative race. We'll take care of that race, but I'm fortunate to have you in Congress representing Georgia's 6th congressional district.
Thank you. I also want to share with, as I'm thinking about Nikema and Lucy, at the end of the day, I want people to recognize that was Newt Gingrich's seat. So you talk about change. So she actually holds a seat that was held by the architect who I think actually ushered in this whole Republican attaching itself to this regressive policies that were literally embedded in there with some anti-Blackness. And so I think part of what we have to know is how that her very presence is a part and reflective of the change. And so I think part of what we have to do is, one, we have to support organizations that a lot of times we're waiting on individuals to run. When we're looking at racism in this country, it's structural racism. It's not just candidates. They have organizations and resources and businesses behind them. Like, we have to make sure that we're providing some support for the women that we're supporting. And so organizations like Vote, Run, Lead, organizations like Higher Heights, that Collective PAC, that are actually supporting candidates, progressive candidates, one, we've got to write some checks, right? Secondly, I think we also have to encourage women to run. That oftentimes, the difference between part of our leadership is servant leadership, right? And so I know even most women who run for office is because someone has encouraged them to run for office, right? And so, you know, a man will do one thing and just jump out and run and say, I'm going to be the leader, right? But I think what is really important is that we create these networks, that we are encouraging women to run as well, and that we're actually saying we're creating these kitchen cabinets so that we can actually put some cushion around them as well. And the third thing is we've got to do the work, and we've got to demand and push back that fundamentally what women of color are faced with is not only is at the intersection of sexism and racism. Just recently, there was a group of us that were actually encouraging, saying that we wanted a Black woman as a VP pick for Biden. What was really interesting is when Biden said, and this when he said that he would pick a woman, there wasn't any controversy. Then when we said a Black woman, and all of a sudden it was like, well, which one, right? That in some way, that in order to say a woman of color, that we've got to be exceptional, that we've got to prove that we deserve to serve. But people, you know, and so I think fundamentally, in what circumstance would women, and I'm thinking about Black women in particular, Black women have been the highest turnout base of the as the Democratic Party for 50 years, yet we have never been at the top of the ticket. It would be unconscionable for that to be a white man. It'd be unconscionable. Somebody would think it was something wrong with the party for that to be the case. So I think we also have to.
No, I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you off, LaTosha, but I want to bring Ava back into this. I totally agree with everything you said.
I was into that story. I was like, yes. Yes. You cut her off.
I'm sorry. We have a very tight schedule. So, Ava, before we wrap with this segment, you know, not everyone can run for office. And, you know, you're a storyteller, you're an artist. That's how you often contribute. What other ways do you see people making profound change in our communities?
I am happy to answer the question. I very much just want to hear the end respectfully of what was being said. You were saying it would be unconscionable for them to put someone else at the top of the ticket other than a sister.
No, I was saying it's unconscionable for there to be a base where white men would be the majority of the turnout base of the party, and within 50 years, there would not be a white man that we represented. It would be an expectation that white men.
Copy. Great point. Yes. Okay. My question was about other people and doing things.
Yes. What are other ways people can contribute?
You know, be the people of Selma and push Dr. King forward. Be the person that texts Lucy McBath and says, you can do it. You know what I mean? I'm with you. Be the person that, you know, stands out there and registers someone in this film, and she could be next. You know, when I watch the film, I see the people around the person, right? I see all the people pushing folks forward, the person who stops and listens when someone knocks on your door. You know, when someone's trying to hand out that flyer at the grocery store, to stop and listen and don't just walk past. I'm really bad at that. I'll be like, I'm just trying to get my Pringles. But let's stop, you know? And what about maybe being that person that hands that out? You know, everyone has a different role to play. And, you know, whether you know, I tell people all the time, you know, there can only be one director, but a director can't do anything unless all those crew members, all those names that you don't watch at the end of the movie, when you get up and you leave the theater, or when you turn off your TV, are the people that have really made that film. And the people who have really made these candidates are the folks who voted for them and who helped them get in that place. And so all of that matters. And if you are not the one who's going to be running, then be the one standing next to the one who's running, or be the one standing up for the one that's running. And that's something that we can all do. And it doesn't just mean, I'm getting really tired, just exhausted with the whole idea, just telling people, vote. Just vote. You know, it's a dead word to me, to be honest. You know, as someone who's really studied the struggle and has done work around it, both in real life and on screen, you know, we need to revitalize that word. I think a part of it is to understand that we have to not just vote, defend your vote. Defend your vote, because there are people trying to take it away. Just like people are trying to take lives away, people are trying to take these votes away. And if it didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying to take it so much. So it's important that we rally around the folks that are trying to be in that position, that we are the folks who are standing and lifting them up,
but that also we defend our right to make sure that they're in the positions that they need to be in.
All right, that was an amazing discussion. I wish I could talk to you guys forever, but we have a whole other panel right after you. So thank you all. You all give me hope for the future. And speaking of the future, let's watch one more short clip from And She Could Be Next.
How you feeling? Ain't stop, won't stop. When I say black voters, you say matter. Black voters, black voters. Our goal is to move voters to the polls, right? We've seen this uprising of people of color, Asian American groups, of immigrant groups, of Black groups, of African groups, of LGBTQ groups, this coalition of people coming together in ways, and I'll say in my adult life, I've not seen. Ultimately, if we're going to change and move this country forward, it's going to take us banding together and create a coalition of the willing that is rooted in power and love, and that we're going to transform this country.
Access granted.
In our community, we hear a lot of my vote doesn't count talk, you know, and ends up being a plague. That's the okie doke. It may be the okie in the dope.
When you go to the polls, you see a lot of older people. But for a Black man, it was like a disconnect in the 80s, you know, when crackhead and ravaged our community. That type of support, camaraderie, and mass amounts of people coming out to support kind of stopped.
Yo, what up, what up, what up? How you doing, baby? Yes, sir, yes, sir.
I seen people getting out talking about voting that I ain't never would have thought would go vote. And that's a good thing. Even me.
While we don't put our faith in one elected official and their ability to sort of work miracles and make magic happen, people power is real, and our fight for the Georgia that we want to live in is not in vain.
All right, for the second half of our conversation, I'm excited to welcome Nse Ufot, CEO of New Georgia Project, Mary Hooks, co-director of Southerners on New Ground, Jessica Byrd, founder and chief doer at 3 Point Strategies, and Jennifer Apps-Addison, network president and co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. All right, let's jump right in. Tonight, we've referenced voter suppression and seen some of the ways it has functioned, particularly in Georgia. Based on your work, Nse, how widespread is voter suppression, and how have you seen it impact people and communities?
It is widespread. It is, let me tell you what's happening. I don't want to use a bunch of flowery language. They are taking a sledgehammer to our elections infrastructure because we are winning, because we're building power, because we are making strides towards building the city, the country that we want to live in. And it is a problematic, I think it's problematic in a marketplace of ideas. Conservatives are bankrupt. People are not buying their stuff anymore. I told my mama I would watch the language. And so if people aren't buying your policy platform, then you have to cheat. You have to figure out a way to suppress votes, to shrink the electorate, to make sure that only people who agree with you vote. And so it's gotten more sophisticated. But we're winning. And I think that for every new tactic that we see, like purging people, we are also watching organizers and ordinary citizens rise up, spread the word about what's happening, and we are seeing overwhelming turnout that we hope will neutralize the impacts of voter suppression.
My next question is for Mary. What are additional challenges to access to the polls you anticipate in November, particularly taking into account that we don't yet know if and when a second wave of COVID-19 will strike?
Yeah, I think that there's sorry friends, tree down, power's out, it's wild in my hood. Appreciate that. But I think we can certainly anticipate there's a fear, you know what I mean? And I think, capitalism always gives us false choices. And so what does that mean for our people to have to choose between, mobilizing to the poll, where I think most people feel, if I get to the poll and actually do the machine, my vote will be counted, or engage in a paper process where that could be compromised. I've literally heard people say, now, how many stamps should I put on? I don't know if they're going to take it. And so I think that there's certainly a real fear. And so I think our work as community organizers and folk who have, access to, PPE and ways in which people can still mobilize to the polls and be able to support, voting places, to think about what are the safety protocols that are happening is going to be critical and necessary to make sure that folks feel, confident that they can, actually go to the polls. And I think it's going to be, and there's always a challenge particularly for folks who are currently detained, specifically those who are being detained in cages that are pre-trial, because many people can still vote pre-trial. If you get arrested the night before, you know what I mean, and you're there, you can still vote. And so we've been pushing here the need to have a polling place inside of the jail. And so many people are being disenfranchised and don't have access in so many ways that many people aren't thinking about. And so for those folks who we're pushing to get out because of COVID, but we also know that we have not seen a strong enough push, if you will, or desire to free people. And so there's many ways in which votes are being apprehended. And I think we have to do our diligence to make sure that there are strong safety measures in place, because I believe when we saw the turnout in the primary, people are like, no, I'm going to go vote, honey. And people came out and have been out in the streets to vote. And so in terms of challenging what's happening, so people are ready to come out and move. We just have to do our due diligence to make sure we provide as much safety as possible, given the circumstances.
Does anyone else have anything else they'd like to add in regards to the additional challenges we may be facing in November?
I think that it is not alarmist to think that we might have to deal with violence at the polls. I think that, given the times that we're in and the sort of disproportionate response to the state that the state has sort of levied in response to the demands that people are making for, a just society, that it's a real thing. I think that the RNC, the sort of consent decree that they have been operating under for some decades, has now expired. I think that when we talk about safety and making sure that people are safe when exercising their right to vote, that it's making sure that folks are safe from unnecessary exposure to coronavirus. I think that we're talking about people keeping people safe in terms of making sure that, we aren't met with harm or violence at the polls. And I think that safety in terms of making sure that our vote counts, that the ballot makes it there, and that those are real concerns that we have not had to deal with all together in one election. And I think that people are responding by saying, you know what, I'm going to do what I have to do. I am at once heartened, but also pissed off about all of the stories of people planting their feet on solid ground and saying, I don't care how long it takes, I'm going to stand here and vote. I hate that people have to make that choice. I hate that that's a story of our resilience. I mean, I hate that we have to be resilient in that way in order to participate in our democracy. And I am encouraged because people are doing it and doing it in numbers despite all of that.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. It's incredible. I want to bring in Jessica now. The systemic, intentional nature of voter suppression, it feels overwhelming. What should people be doing right now to ensure that their vote will count And should we be talking about vote by mail, early voting, or something else?
Yes to all of the things that you just named. Absolutely. Hey, everyone. And thank you for this conversation. It's such a nice way to see my friends as well. One is that a lot of the footage that you'll see tonight was from 2018, where I was serving as chief of staff to Stacey Abrams. And in her non-concession speech that I imagine that we'll see tonight is she says, we all deserve a fair fight, and has gone on to build an organization called Fair Fight Action that specifically works every single day with a legal, organizing, and voter protection strategy to ensure that voters are covered. And so one is everyone should go to Fair Fight. You also should ensure that you, in a state like Georgia, where voter purges are real, you should be going to the Secretary of State's website. Not that we think that he is a validator of voting in any way. But one thing I did just want to say here really quickly, and why I actually have this, I've had this belly feeling as I think about watching the footage tonight or watching the episode tonight is, the Abrams campaign did everything that it possibly could to create a voter protection mechanism, and not just alone. A beautiful, huge, expansive operation. Nse leading parts of that, the Democratic Party of Georgia leading parts of that, the Abrams campaign at the top of the ticket leading parts of that, and many, many, many others doing the political education and protection work. And one of the reasons that we were able to non-concede was because people trusted that we knew the numbers, that we weren't lying, we weren't grandstanding, we weren't trying to create just a moment, that it wasn't about Stacey's career, it was about the fact that we made a commitment to everyone. And I still remember the day when I heard that protesters were going to take to the state capitol and demand that they count every vote. And I remember Mary Hook's beautiful red lipstick and her dope ass hat. And I remember watching her on the live stream and thinking, this is movement. This is movement. Here I am in leadership of this campaign. There Nse is in leadership of a voting rights organization and voting mobilization organization. There Mary is the head of a radical Black queer liberatory organization in the South. And what do? They tackle her. The first thing that they do as they approach the protesters is go straight for Mary. And I remembered that because I thought about how powerful it was, how connected we were in the continuum of movement, and how that also meant that the first thing they had to do was to take down someone that we additionally trusted outside of Stacey. And that shows the violence of white nationalism as it permeates itself in our election system. And it also shows that when we stand together as a united front to lift up the voices of our people, that if they do some funky stuff in November, we're not going home without a fight at all. We'll stay there all day and all night.
All right, I want to bring in Jennifer now. Do you think the current uprisings that are about fighting against racial violence and inequalities in Black communities are a sign of sea change? Do you anticipate more people running for office and more people refusing to let their vote and voice be silenced?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, let me just say, it is such an honor, to be listening, to learn from these sheroes every single day. And this film is about women of color, and there are incredible women of color across many geographies and demographics in this film. But to have a moment to spotlight the leadership and the necessity of Black women in transforming this country is really, really critical. And I'm grateful to the filmmakers for creating this space. Our network's role in this film, you see Black women from all across our organizing network hear the call of Nse on the ground to do everything possible to make a moment happen in Georgia. And you see these Black women coming in having nothing but faith in the candidate and in the process and in their ability to make a miracle happen right in the South. And in this moment where it feels like we are left to fend for ourselves, where, you know, the federal government, Democrats and Republicans alike, have failed to respond to the crisis that COVID is creating, particularly in Black communities, right? In a moment in which you see people in the streets demanding a defunding of the police. In New York, activists just this morning, just, you know, hours ago, being cleared violently from an occupation outside of City Hall, demanding that their voices be listened to. And we hear Democrats, right, like saying, oh, we're going to reform things, right? Not listening to the actual voices of people. What people have to understand about what we saw in 2016 and why we were able to make history is because people didn't have to be convinced of the power of these women of color to create change. They believed it so deeply in their souls that they were willing to travel across geography at their own, you know, expense to try to help make these voices heard. And we don't have that in this country if we don't have a democracy that functions, if we don't listen to the people who are most marginalized, if we don't actually trust Black women. We say trust Black women, but then we do everything in our power to make it impossible for them to lead authentically as their true selves. And I think, you know, this is a moment where we can actually move something differently. There is a campaign happening. There will be a presidential election, the results of which will, I think, fundamentally change the course of human history. And what we know is that Black women and women of color will be the determining factor in where the future of this country goes. And so you see the possibility in this film, because you see the organizers who are on the ground, like Jessica, like Nse, like Mary, right, who are on the ground making it happen every single day. So that to me is it a natural occurrence that these uprisings are going to lead to a defeat of Donald Trump? No, it's not a natural occurrence, right? There is a lot that can be done to suppress that vote, not just from the Republicans, but actually from the reaction to people owning their power from the Democrats. But what I do know is that the more people are in the streets, the more people understand their political process, the more people are hyper, radicalized around their local city budgets and their municipal elections, the more opportunities people have to step into democracy right now in this moment. That leads to a possibility that we can not only defeat Donald Trump, but that we could defeat fascism and white supremacy along with him.
All right. I want to say thank you to all our panelists for your time here tonight and for the vital work that each one of you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I want to thank everyone at home who joined us tonight, as well as our panelists and all of you watching. And remember, watch episode 2 of And She Could Be Next on PBS now, immediately following this broadcast. Check your local PBS listing or watch it streaming at andshecouldbenext.com. Don't just vote, make a plan to vote. And are you excited to shake things up and make this democracy work for all of us? Find your political home, local organizations who can help you step into your leadership. Learn more about it at andshecouldbenext.com. I'm Danielle Belton, Editor-in-Chief of The Root. Thank you and good night.